welcome to everyone from Jesuit parishes and the broader Catholic network. We're so grateful to have all of you with us. The past few months and have been especially challenging for our nation, and I think for our church as well, as we discern how to more deeply commit ourselves to bringing an end to racism and white supremacy, both in society and in our church, in our local communities. And we've been heartened by the energy that we have encountered within the Ignatian network and beyond on about this work. And I think we can all acknowledge that when we think about the complexity of the realities that our country and our church face, it is very easy to acknowledge that there are there are some things that are very simple and very cut and dry, and there are other things that, as we try to dismantle systems that are unjust and racist, and that they're very complex, right? But I also think our faith, our common bond as people of faith, as Catholics, as people deeply committed to the inherent dignity of all people, that is a great lens. I can't think of a better lens through which to do this work. And so we're so grateful to have you kind of walking with us in doing it. We acknowledge that, as an organization, we're a predominantly white-led organization. And so we come with our own baggage in that, and our own struggles that we have to acknowledge. And but we can only, we have to find ways to move forward. We have to find ways to respond, and we know that we won't do everything perfect. We'll make mistakes. We'll struggle. We might say things that aren't perfect. Might do things that aren't perfect. But we really believe that this work is vital. It's deeply connected to our roots as an organization that started out of the human rights movements in Central America and responding to the role of U.S. intervention in Central America, and continues to be part of the work we do, and has tremendous intersections with the work we do on ecology and on migration and other issues as well. So thank you so much for being with us. We're really grateful to have you, and looking forward to all that comes from this today.
I'm really grateful to be here, and not at all nervous to go first. Thank you. No, I am really grateful to have the opportunity to share a little bit of our anti-racism journey. I'm Christine. I'm the Director of Social Ministry at St. Francis Xavier College Church on SLU's campus in St. Louis, Missouri. And just briefly to start off, I'd like to share a little bit from my own journey that I think relates to our work as a parish. A few years back at an anti-racism workshop, I was asked, as part of a reflection, the question, when did you first realize that you were white? And I realized that I couldn't answer that question. Of course, I know that I'm white, but without even being conscious of it, I'd always been taught to view whiteness as the norm and as the standard. And I'd never really had to realize that I was white. I just was. And I think that experience resonates with our journey at College Church, and might ring true for some of you, especially in predominantly white parishes. The color that many white people in institutions are unable to see most is white. And in order to move from being simply non-racist to anti-racist, we have to start seeing whiteness and all of the ways that it's maintaining the status quo in our church and across many of our parishes. So to start off, Aaron, if you want to advance just a couple slides there, I'll skip over the overview slide. In 2014, after Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, and during the Ferguson uprising, our parish had to reckon with a lot of pretty harsh realities about racism. So a group of parishioners with staff support formed our Racism and Reconciliation Committee in 2014, which continues to this day. That committee has been largely focused on educational and formation programs for the parish, done a lot of relationship building within our deanery, and offered some resources for learning more about racial justice. And that group has done a lot to put racial justice on the consciousness of our parish, along with leadership from the pulpit over the past nearly 6 years. And at the same time, in 2018, we started to ask the question, like, it's great that we're offering all of this programming, but how do we actually know that we're changing as an institution? How do we know that we're less racist or that we're becoming more anti-racist than we were when we started? And we realized we couldn't really answer that question. So on the next slide, that's when we started to set ourselves on more of an intentional path of becoming an anti-racist parish. So moving from this mindset of just having a committee that's focused on racial justice to being a parish that's on a journey of becoming anti-racist as an institution. And that this change would be obvious through every part of our parish, every ministry, to ourselves and to the people around us. So we started to work with a group called Crossroads Anti-Racism, which is an organization that focuses on institutional anti-racism change. And depending on where you are in the country, there's various groups like Crossroads who do this work. And I really think it's pivotal to partner with groups like this so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are lots of organizing groups that have done this, and by done this, I mean it's a lifelong continual journey, but they're on this journey and know how to help parishes and other groups get started. And often there's faith-based or Christian or Catholic-based groups that do this as well. So for us, we started to meet monthly as an anti-racism team. We convened a group of leaders, staff and parishioners that were intentionally across all ministries of our parish, not just within a certain area of the parish. And we determined with Crossroads that one of our first steps would be to do parish-wide focus groups to find out where the parish thought that we are in terms of anti-racism, and shared the summarized findings with the parish, which I'm happy to share with anyone who would like to see those. I will say that I sometimes cringe at the thought of doing surveys and focus groups. I think that can sort of get in the way or be sort of a checklist thing to do. But since we were committed to this work, for us, it really was an important part of cultivating buy-in into the process and actually helping us understand where our parish is rather than assuming that we know. And I'll note that we held a focus group specifically for parishioners of color, and I think it was really important to offer that space in particular because some of the groups or some of the experiences shared by that group illuminated the reality that a lot of our parishioners of color still do not feel fully welcomed in our parish. So in addition to the focus groups, members of our team attended a one-day training through Crossroads, which offered us some shared analysis and tools for understanding where we are as a church and where we're going. And the next slide shows something that you probably will not be able to read, but just wanted to give you a visual of something that I can also send out to folks called the Continuum on Becoming an Anti-Racist Multicultural Organization. And this continuum was really helpful for us because it offers really specific, concrete descriptors of where we might be along this process. And so we realized, while we'd like to think we're in that number 6 category, we're actually probably somewhere closer to the number 3 column for a compliance organization, which was a bit of a wake-up call for us and also helped ground us because we know if we can look at that number 4 column, that can help us to determine where we're going and what it might look like once we're at that next step in being an affirming institution. So it was actually a helpful tool for us along this journey. And then on the next slide, just some next steps for us are that we had planned to host a 2.5-day training through Crossroads, but surprise, a global pandemic happened in March and we couldn't do that. But we are looking at some other opportunities for formation in the meantime. We're reading this book called Becoming an Anti-Racist Church by one of the founders of Crossroads, which has provided some really helpful resources and specific practical tools for working towards institutional change from a Christian context. And we're also considering an institutional anti-racism audit to look at everywhere from our programs and personnel to our organizational structure and our mission statement asking the questions, who has power, who benefits, who is left out, really taking an honest look at where we stand in terms of anti-racism at our parish. We also have recognized how important it is to communicate with the whole parish about what we're doing, and for communication to be across ministries, because a lot of times the work is happening in different areas, and that's really great. And it's important to be in communication with one another about that. One important step across the last few years that's been important for us too is recognizing our history as part of this journey. For us, this has meant celebrating Black Catholic History Month in November, raising up the stories of holy people of color throughout our history, Catholics who contributed so much to our faith, especially in St. Louis in particular. It's also meant recognizing and naming the reality that the Jesuits and College Church in particular have benefited from the labor of enslaved people. The Slavery History, Memory, and Reconciliation SHMR project with the Jesuits is doing a lot of really good work in that area, and it's really painful, but also really important. On the next slide, I just listed some key partnerships for us. I've mentioned some of these already, but just to highlight in particular, we're part of the North City Deanery, which is our geographical deanery in St. Louis. And that group has been a really key partner for us, building relationships. As a predominantly white church, a lot of the churches in our deanery are predominantly Black or white and Black parishes. And so it's important for us to be building relationships where we can be accountable to one another, and know that our work impacts our deanery, and that that's been a really important thing for us. Some other key partners, the Central and Southern Province of the Jesuits. Mary Baudouin, I know, is on this call and she's the social ministries person for the UCS province and has been a key resource for connecting us with other people, sharing her insights as to what's out there in terms of racial justice resources and other parishes doing the work. We're also connected with our local faith-based community organizing group, MCU, for the local community action piece of this that's very much rooted in anti-racism. And we also have leaned on mentors who have done this before and have already started this work before us. In particular for us, the Dominican Sisters in Springfield, Illinois, have allowed us to shadow some of their meetings, talk to us about what their process has looked like. They also work with Crossroads, so it's really relevant to us. And rather than guessing or trying to do it on our own, they've been really gracious about working with us and sharing what they've learned. And then finally on the next page, some key takeaways that we've learned often through making mistakes are partnerships, as I mentioned, and especially accountability relationships are important. Being accountable to parishioners of color and being accountable to Catholics of color and people of color in the wider community, which is not easy. There's a lot of tensions between not leaning on people of color to teach us and also building authentic relationships. And when I say us, I mean white people who have the opportunity to do this work. And then becoming an anti-racist parish, it does require at some point institutional buy-in. There's costs associated with workshops and working with groups. There's the need to integrate everything we do into who we say we are. For example, we just created a new strategic plan and made becoming an affirming institution on the continuum part of our parish strategic plan. And at the same time, if you're not there, you can start where you can and build relationships from there. Just knowing that at some point it does become important for it to move from an interest group to a parish-wide priority. And you don't have to have the answers in order to ask the questions. And in fact, it's really important to realize that we won't have all of the answers, and that often the next steps become clear as you start moving. Being strategic about the work. So for us, it's important that we have our anti-racism team that's thinking about where we're headed, while also recognizing that it's really great when the work is decentralized and that it's happening all over. No one owns this work. Ideally, it will permeate from every ministry of the parish. The next one's a really tricky one. Racial justice is not charity. I know we have a social service program that we really care about at the parish, and there isn't a need for social service programs since we don't have justice. And at the same time, it's really important not to conflate charity work with racial justice work. There's a lot there that is an entire number of presentations in and of itself. And finally, I think this is a stumbling block that we've run into, is that it can be easy to recognize racism out there in the world, and it can be harder to turn inward and actually focus on how we're implicated in it. So an important part of this process for us has been focusing on ourselves, on the church, and on our parish in a special way, and knowing that change has to start at home, and we have to be clear about what we need to do to change, as we're also a part of this wider community that needs a lot of change. And so finally, the last slide, I don't actually know where this quote came from or where I heard it, but that's something that stuck with me, is just thinking about what is your next most faithful step. So it can be overwhelming to think about all of the things that need to happen, and there are a lot of urgent things that need to happen. And at the same time, what's the next step you can take, or I can take, that will lead us towards clarity on what the step after that will be.
Hi, everybody. My name is Boreta Singleton from St. Francis Xavier Parish, and with me today is the chair of our pastoral council, Catherine Wolfe, and I know there's several parishioners here as well. So just very briefly, our process, we started with a few parishioners talking to one another. We tried to pay attention, notice what you notice. And we started networking based on reading and investigating some local possibilities, especially those to connect with other parishes in Black and brown neighborhoods, because our parish is predominantly white. So it was good for us to have some connections across the board. And then we also have a number of things happening at the same time: some self-education, prayer, networking, and some action steps. So in 2018, I had a brief conversation with our then acting pastor about the fact that we had addressed many social justice issues in our parish, but we had not yet looked at racial justice. And so a member of the pastoral council approached me, and we started talking with some members of the pastoral council, Catherine specifically, as well as another member of the pastoral council and a Black parishioner, to talk about some first steps. We started with a book club, people reading Father Brian Massengale's Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, and we invited Father Massengale to speak at Xavier at our parish. One of the parishioners in this small group that we were working together knew Dr. Craig Ford at Fordham. He's an African-American theology professor, and we invited him to join us for a conversation and some continued steps. So in 2019, the book club expanded, and the racial justice ministry kind of, I think, started to come together. Dr. Ford came and visited the parish and went to every mass and just kind of got a sense of the community. As this was also happening in Harlem, the pastor of St. Charles Borromeo Church, who's also Jesuit, had invited Father Brian Massengale to give a series of talks there on racial justice, and invited our parish and also two other parishes in Manhattan to come together for that. So in those conversations, we had some members of the racial justice ministry who were the book club group, and also some of our pastoral council, our pastor, and some other parishioners. We focused on racial justice as the major topic at our annual pastoral council 2-day retreat, and Dr. Ford gave a talk after one of the masses, and then we also had Father Massengale come and preside at the mass and give a talk as well on his book. In 2020, this year, before the pandemic, we hosted a parish-wide retreat, ministries retreat. So the heads of the parish ministries come together for a retreat. And we had racial justice as a topic. Dr. Ford spoke initially to a small group of us and then spoke at the larger retreat. And, you know, he was asked to kind of help us to unpack the issues that we heard both from the book club and also at St. Charles at the Parish, where we came together with the other parishes. Since the pandemic, we've had a phone conversation with Dr. Ford, and he's going to make a series of videos for us that we can use with the various ministries to talk about racial justice topics. And since the pandemic, our racial justice ministry has hosted 2 prayer services after the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. The director of adult formation and I are going to host Faith and Racial Equity, sponsored by the Just Faith Ministries, which has the same kind of, in a way, like Crossroads. I've worked with Crossroads, so the very similar idea of partnering with a group to get some information and also to get some tools. As you say, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? You know, and at the end of every Mass, the assembly is invited to take a pledge for racial justice. I found that racial justice pledge on a website from a church in Texas, and we have adopted it for ourselves. And several of our parish ministries, including our religious ed, family faith, have made a statement regarding their work for racial justice. So that's about where we are. I'm going to turn this over to Catherine.
So my contribution to, the last thing we have is we're going to have a Zoom meeting for all the ministries on July 29th to talk about their prayer and their plans going forward from the prayer services that we had. My contribution to this is to talk about the challenge that pursuing racial justice poses for white people. And in the outline that you'll get, you'll see the first thing that I started with is the challenge, not the spiritual context for meeting the challenge. I'm going to reverse that though, because I was conflicted, which comes first, the chicken or the egg, the challenge or the grounding. And the spiritual context, I think, grows out of an inchoate yearning that we have for unity and for sisterhood and brotherhood, and our Ignatian foundational principles really make pursuing that yearning pretty straightforward and I think simple. You know, if we follow Ignatius in finding God in all things, if we believe truly in cura personalis, the Magus and the other Ignatian principles, if we really are women and men for others and contemplatives in action, and you can take in your community any one of those phrases to build more reflection and grounding from those. But if we adhere to those principles, then righting the injustices and the inequities that define the lives of our brown brothers and sisters is really an imperative. It's not an option. It's not a Saturday afternoon activity. It is an imperative that is central to who we are as Catholics, as Christians, as Americans, as people, as brothers and sisters. So I think that makes the challenge a little simpler, as complicated and as painful as it is. The challenge itself is we white people don't see institutional and systemic racism because it is so foundational to our lives. We don't see day to day how we benefit from racism, but we do day in and day out. We don't see how our intellectual and emotional defenses against the ideas of and emotions that would disrupt and dismantle racism. And most importantly, we don't see our Black and brown brothers and sisters as they present themselves to us. We see them according to the narrative that we have adopted ourselves, and that gives us comfort as we confront the challenge of these very deep-seated and foundational inequities. So how, very briefly, how do we go about uncovering and dealing with meeting the challenge? I have a couple of points in the outline. We need to re-educate ourselves. Once you start to read American history, Eastern, European history, once you start to look at how we exploited the Native Americans and enslaved Africans to build the society that we have here, you really want to turn away. Once we start to educate ourselves about the role of the American Catholic Church in its mistreatment of people of color, and once ethnic Catholics like myself confront the truly horrific things that my forebears in New York City did to the African American communities from the 1800s on, and every one of us who grew up with cops and firemen and love cops and firemen, when you recognize the true oppression that we imposed upon our Black brothers and sisters, it's a real awakening. And one of the things it does with us, I think, is it makes us very fearful. And we have to overcome that fear. It's another reason why for the importance of the spiritual grounding we have. We're fearful because we know that the history is against us, and we all feel a little exceptional, and we're good people, and we feel very uncomfortable being on the wrong side of something. If you are comfortable in this process, you are doing it wrong. We are designed to be, it is designed for us to be uncomfortable, truly, truly miserable, and not knowing where to turn. Another aspect of this is to listen with all your heart and all your senses and everything that you can bring to an encounter, so that the person of color who is talking to you has the experience of being heard. Not heard on your terms, but heard in the terms of what it is that they are communicating to me as another sister. You'll see it in the outline. Communally and individually, then we have to face that fear. We have to face the fear that we have when we confront somebody who's angry, a person of color who is angry, who has every reason to be angry. We need to absorb that anger, feel that anger, live with that anger, because we really own that anger. And then in terms of finding solutions, the solutions are a cause of fear. You are, in order to right these inequities, we have to go to the foundations of our society, to true power and control sharing, to true resource sharing, so that the inequities that are so apparent in education and housing and healthcare can be addressed. These are really, really real. And then last of all, keep asking why. When we use a very easy term, all lives matter, Black lives matter, all lives matter. Why? Ask your friend, why? What did you mean by that? Deconstruct that and go layer by layer, deeper and deeper. And at the bottom of it all, I think we have to confront the fact that people do believe that Black and brown people are inferior. And that's the heart of what we have to address. That's the heart of the problem. On the positive side, make eye contact, ask a question, ask another question, smile, rejoice in what we are, rejoice in what we have to offer each other.
Hello all, I am Monica Smith. I'm from St. Ignatius Loyola Parish in Sacramento. And we can go to the first slide, Erin. So I want to tell you a little, I'm fairly new to my parish. I will have been there 3 years this August. And our current journey towards racial equity began in the pews with myself and fellow parishioners who were committed to social justice. As I said, I'm a fairly new parishioner. I joined in 2017, but both I and my original co-facilitators had participated in Just Faith ministry programs before at other parishes. And when we learned that Just Faith was introducing a module to focus on racism and racial equity, we wanted to bring that to St. Ignatius as a good start to educating our parish. So we recommended it to our social ministry coordinator. And in the beginning, the team that was involved in the early stage was our social ministry coordinator, the pastoral associate, myself, and the co-facilitators. So next slide. So after getting approval, we registered for the program in the fall of 2019. So we began last fall and we began the planning process. But we really wanted to open up our parish, which is predominantly a white, affluent parish, to learning and talking about racism. So we offered a review of the U.S. Bishop's pastoral letter, Open Wide Our Hearts, and Bishop Sight's letter, Night Will Be No More. And if you haven't read both of those, I highly recommend them. We held the review over 3 evenings during Advent, and it was modeled on a small faith sharing group. So we included individual review and group discussion. We also invited a local Catholic high school student to join us one evening and share her experience with racism in her high school. And that gave our participants the opportunity to listen to the impact of racism on a young person from our community. After we finished the sessions, a few of those participants decided to join the Just Faith program. So we began program registration 3 weeks prior to the start of the Just Faith program. Over the first weekend, I was asked by our pastor to speak at the end of Mass and to introduce the program and invite parishioners to participate. We also included the general communications of announcements in the bulletin and the website. So that's how we started. So next slide. Okay, so we launched Faith and Racial Equity, which is the first module of the Just Faith series, in February. And then there was this pandemic. So we had to continue online via Zoom after our shelter in place was ordered in mid-March. We had enough signups that we had 2 sessions going simultaneously for the program. But after completing the program, I piloted 2 small discussion groups to continue engagement on the topics of racism and racial equity and to not lose momentum with the people who had been participating. In April, which is when we finished the Just Faith program, it was not clear when we would be able to meet again in person, and the group and I wanted to continue learning together. So we developed a list of resources, books, films, podcasts that participants could review individually or we could discuss as a group. And then we continued to meet bi-weekly to discuss films and books. And then after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, I have to say that our group was so incredibly grateful to already have a group to share and discuss these issues with. One of the other great things about what we did this fall was that we've identified new leaders and facilitators that came out of this group that are moving forward into our new groups and into the new organization or ministry that we've started. So next slide. So I want to share a few key things that we've learned from our experience. One, it's really important for leaders and facilitators to have training and ideally a deeper understanding of racism and racial equity. Understanding the language and issues are critically important. This is one of those areas where a little bit of knowledge can absolutely be dangerous. So it is important, and for what we're doing in our parish is that people that are going to be leaders and facilitators need to have completed one of the Just Faith programs, other anti-racism training as a key step forward. The involvement of our pastor and the pastoral team and office staff was really important to support the effort. It is helpful to have the pastor and priest incorporate the topics of racial equity in their homilies and to bring attention to the racial equity initiatives in their communication. It is also ideal to have people in color engaged as leaders and facilitators. And I know that this can be a challenge in parishes where there are limited numbers of people of color, but it's really critically important as we work towards racial equity that we hear and listen to the voices of those most impacted by racism. So if there are not people in your parish that can be involved in this work, partner with organizations, other parishes perhaps outside of your parish that can help you make sure those voices get heard. Just Faith has 3 modules, and what we found is that they provide a really solid foundation for educating participants, for building small face sharing groups and creating engagement. And the final, and I think really important piece is that education serves as a foundation for a larger effort. So as you plan education for your parish community, it's really important to develop a plan of continued engagement with parishioners, including ongoing education and community involvement. So next slide. How we're continuing our journey. So we've began a racial equity group to lead efforts in our parish and our larger community. This is a new ministry that did not exist before. We will be holding a prayer service for racial justice that will be hosted by this new racial equity group. We're expanding the number of Just Faith modules we'll be offering beginning in August. We're going to run all 3 programs simultaneously. And we're going to continue our small discussion groups. We're also developing plans to collaborate outside of our parish in the larger Sacramento community. And we're coordinating with our Black Catholic ministry to amplify their efforts and build community across parishes. And the Black Catholic ministry is associated with the diocese. So this is an organization that goes across multiple parishes. So next slide. So this gives you a look at some of the things that we've done already and what I mean by community engagement. So we began our community engagement in parallel with running the Just Faith program. And these are just a couple of examples. A group of us walked in the MLK March in January, including participants from the Just Faith program and people who had attended the pastoral letter review. And so we joined with community activists in what is an annual event in Sacramento, which was a great day. And the woman on the right corner of that first top picture, that's me in the white coat. She actually had never marched in anything in her life. She's from Germany and was very excited to be invited, and can't wait for next year. So we'll probably be doing it with mass next year, but we will absolutely be marching in the streets. Another thing is that real engagement in community building can also happen outside of the classroom and outside of book discussions. I think the arts are an important channel to connect with the work of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. So we attended a local play called When We Were Colored, which is a story of an African-American family and their experience with racism after moving to Sacramento post-World War II. It was held in an African-American neighborhood in a community theater. And that was just a really great experience for everyone that participated. And then we had follow-up discussions afterwards, because some people who had grown up white in Sacramento weren't aware of the history and the experiences of African-Americans in this community and how they experience redlining and discrimination. So we're going to continue to engage in the community and engage in peaceful protest as well, and support our brothers and sisters that are marching for racial justice.
So I'm Tim Severyn. I am the Director of Social Mission for Bellarmine Chapel. We are the Catholic parish on Xavier University's campus. We don't work with students though. You can go to the next slide. So I think, like a lot of the groups who've already presented, it's really important to own who we are. We are predominantly white, college-educated parish, very, very privileged. And I think of letter from a Birmingham jail where he's calling out the liberal churches. That is our church. So same tool here I'm sharing that Christine shared at the beginning, we've used for that becoming an anti-racist parish. And I agree with her that we're probably bouncing between 2 and 4 at best. So presenting here not as in any way an expert, but as fellow folks on this journey. Our journey within this parish began back in 2007 when we formed a dismantling racism team in the parish, responding to some of the things happening locally in Cincinnati around race. And that group has really been the animating force for us moving forward. Next slide. So thinking about how and that group started and what the pieces were to make that work for us, 3 things sort of came to mind. The first, which we've heard already from others, is institutional support. It had to be built into the infrastructure of the parish. So we put staff time behind it. That's my role. We put money behind it. We put it under an infrastructure of social mission. But like several of these other parishes have mentioned, we've tried to identify ways to integrate it into other aspects of parish life. And that is definitely a work in progress. Here you can see it even being visible from the pulpit. In this picture is one of our parishioners of color, a member of our parish for the last 50 years, sharing her stories of racism in the parish itself. So it was a really powerful reflection on the Sunday before MLK Day for us. The other next piece, I think, is taking a community organizing approach. Some of my background is in that, and I think that has really helped us move forward to talk about public narrative, to talk about relationship building and one-to-ones as the way to move this forward. So there are many, many resources out there on organizing, and if you haven't looked at them, I'd encourage you to use them. I can share more later. And then the third, getting to the UAPs, the Universal Apostolic Preferences for the Jesuits, is communal discernment. Our group has now gone through 3 phases of this communal discernment process where we're praying and listening to one another and to our community and to the wider community to identify goals and paths forward and what needs to change and not change. I won't go through all these goals, but we finished a process in January this past year, and these are the goals we set forth for our time moving forward. Next slide. So Pat and I framed this with 4 recommendations or things that have helped us to move forward. The first here is the Ignatian paradigm. The Jesuit parishes will be familiar with it. Others maybe not, also called the pastoral circle. There's some iterations that have 4 steps, some with 5, but here we kept it to the 3: experience, reflection, and action. And it's been useful for us to frame our work around these 3 sort of realms and to help parishioners move through them. So the next 3 recommendations really tie to those 3. The first will be about encounter and relationship, education and prayer, and then advocacy. Roadblocks here, I think, really have to do with just understanding the importance of this tool and having a willingness to move between them. I know too often we think of ourselves as the politically active one who doesn't need the prayer, or as the contemplative one who doesn't need to get out in the world. And this tool, I think, encourages us to be involved in all of it, and as a community to be involved in all of it. Next slide. So the first piece of that is the encounter and relationship. For us, that's been the most important place to start. We started this project called Fresh is Better with our community council from the community of color that surrounds Xavier University. And it's put in educational and residential garden beds with our community members. And really it's been around food and growing food, but the drive behind it has been relationship building. We started it after reading Michael Eric Dyson's book and discussing the idea of reparations and what reparations could look like for a church community. But it's really and fundamentally about that UIP number 2, the apostolic preference 2, be near, be proximate, walk with the excluded, whatever you want to call it. And I think for us, going back to being a privileged community, that's been the roadblock, has been a willingness to listen, to not just act out of our privilege, but to be in real and mutually transformative relationship. And to do that in a way that's messy, to not have the whole path set out before we begin, but to say, we're committed to this. We know that we live, work, play, and pray in segregated spaces, and we don't want that to continue. So this has been an opportunity for our parish to do that and to reflect then upon that. So I'll hand it to Pat to move into that reflection piece.
Good afternoon. My name is Pat Berning. I'm a member of Bellarmine Parish in Cincinnati, Ohio, and have been part of the racism team at our parish for several years. One of the things we realized early on is that we have to own our own identities and recognize our own privilege. This brings about helping us be more humble and admit that we haven't got it all figured out, and that's okay. The more we read and the more we grow, we appreciate our illiteracy in this endeavor. We've had some prayerful education that we've done for our church and our parish. The resource page there was put together recently over the last couple of months so that our parishioners had something to do while they were at home during COVID. We have done 14 different books, and our book discussions have been very rich and informing, and a lot of community has been built around that. We've also utilized Just Faith over the last several years for lots of materials that they have offered, but recently we've heard in previous presentations, the new one that they've put out on faith and racial equality. We started that in the spring and are going to start it up again in the fall. Probably one of the most powerful things we've done recently is utilizing ISN's resource on the Examine White Privilege. Our pastor has been doing an examine every week using Zoom and has had pretty good attendance, but when we did white privilege, the big Zoom picture that you have here on the slide was of over 50 participants in that. It was very, very powerful and was well received by the parish. We've also done Taizé services around many topics, one of which was anti-racism. Our roadblocks, our communities obviously have to come to grips with the fact that we are privileged, and what exactly does that mean? And there can be some pushback around that. Next slide, please. We've also learned to collaborate with other initiatives that are going on in our community. This has been really helpful when we don't want to duplicate some of the projects that are already in place. Amos has been in Cincinnati for several years, and our parish was one of the first to join and continue to support that organization. Intercommunity Justice and Peace Center was founded over 30 years ago by religious communities in Cincinnati, and about 10 years ago, Bellarmine became a supporter of that financially, and we've partnered with them during their Rethinking Racism Way of the Cross. They've also put together an amazing toolkit looking at racism in Cincinnati that we've utilized. The Archdiocese also has a very active anti-racism task force, which Bellarmine is a part of. We've engaged young people along the way. We had an exciting youth poetry slam, which was really fun. And we've also taken up collections to support the Black United Front here in Cincinnati. You may have heard about our collaborative with the police that was developed after the 2003 riots that we had here in Cincinnati. And they are back working very hard in this new environment that we have. Xavier University, of course, is where we're located, and so we're fortunate to partner with them on several endeavors, the most recent of which was a live stream on the color of COVID, talking about the disparities in the new health crisis that we're having right now. Sometimes when you work in partnerships and put on programs together, your own agendas have to adjust, but the partnerships will outweigh any inconvenience that that might have. Next slide, please. And what we've all appreciated during this program is that there's lots and lots of work to do. That diagram that we've seen twice now, the different columns of where your church or your parish might be as far as being an anti-racist parish, looking at that and really being honest about where we find ourselves. We need to seize this moment and lay the foundations so that this work can continue. Digital technology we have found has been very, very helpful. People who typically would not come back in the evening to attend a program at the parish are now eager to be part of a Zoom conversation. We need this to be ongoing and continuous, being challenged how to communicate this to the parish in various formats, using everything in our scope that we can. We are planning an exciting tour to Alabama next year, hopefully in the spring, if not next fall. We are working closely with some Black churches that surround us geographically. We've started that initially, but we need to pursue that more. That's part of our goals for this year. Our next book discussion is going to be Mouse and Gals Work. We're going to have a discussion group later in August on that, and working with our pastor and the staff, really doing a good audit around where we stand as an anti-racist congregation.